So now that we've talked about how muscles work at the molecular and cellular level, we can talk about how they work when it comes to nervous system control. So they kind of are governed by what we call the all or nothing law, or all or none law. When a muscle fiber is given a minimal but adequate stimulus, so input from the nervous system, the muscle fiber will contract maximally. But whole muscles do not follow this. Instead, they are governed by graded responses, or the staircase effect, also known as TREP. This graded fashion is noted by varying degrees of contraction that are demonstrated by an entire muscle. And there's a certain threshold stimulus in order for a minimal stimulation, or a minimal amount of stimulation needed in order for a contraction to occur. So when we're talking about a graded contraction, there's a stimulus strength and frequency. With the stimulus strength, it's an increase in stimulus strength being more motor units contracting. So more muscle fibers are contracting, and this takes place by motor unit recruitment, which we'll get to in the next slide. And then stimulus frequency is the increasing frequency and number of times per second of a threshold stimulus that increases the contraction strength. And individual waves can be added to each other or merge and summate. And so this will all make sense when we start getting into some of the graphs, but this is basically all terminology you're just going to want to understand in order to understand the graphs that are coming up. So like we discussed with the neuromuscular junction, nerves supply the initial contraction. The actual group of muscle fibers in a muscle innervated by a single motor neuron is called the motor unit. When multiple motor units are needed to increase activation of large muscles, recruitment of motor units occurs. As more motor units are recruited, the muscle contraction grows progressively stronger. And in some muscles, the largest motor units can generate a contractile force of like 50 times more than the smallest motor units in the muscle. And this allows, say, like a feather to be picked up using the biceps brachii muscle with minimal force, but then also a heavy weight to be lifted by that same muscle by recruiting the largest motor units. And so you can see we're going through the ventral root here, and we're attaching to muscle fibers, and multiple motor units can attach to the same muscle unit and be elicited in different or in various numbers to elicit a strong or a weak muscle contraction. And so when we talk about the contraction of a muscle, there are phases that the muscle goes through, and these phases of a muscle contraction are known as a twitch, which can last for a few milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, depending on the muscle type. This graph is known as a myogram, which measures tension produced by a twitch. The first phase is the latent period. During this phase, the action potential is being propagated along the sarcolemma, and the calcium ions are released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is the phase during which excitation and contraction are being coupled, but contraction has yet to occur. The next phase would be the contraction period. And so this contraction phase is when the calcium ions in the sarcoplasm have bound to the troponin tropomyosin, and tropomyosin has shifted away from actin binding sites. And so cross bridges form, and then sarcomeres are actively shortening to the peak of, or to the point of peak tension. And then right at this peak, the relaxation period occurs. And this is the last phase. And when tension starts to decrease as the contraction stops, calcium ions are pumped out of the sarcoplasm into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and cross-bridge cycling stops, returning the muscle fibers to their resting state. So although a person can experience a twitch, the twitch won't necessarily produce a significant muscle activity. A series of action potentials to the muscle fibers is required to produce a muscle contraction that can produce work. Normal muscle contraction is more sustained, and it can be modified by input from the nervous system to produce varying amounts of force, called a graded muscle response. The rate at which a motor neuron fires action potentials affects the tension produced in the skeletal muscle. And so if the muscles are stimulated while a previous twitch is still occurring, the second twitch will be stronger. And this response is called a wave summation, because the excitation-contraction coupling effects of successive motor neuron signaling is added together. At the molecular level, the summation occurs because the second stimulus triggers the release of more calcium ions, which become available to activate additional sarcomeres while the muscle is still contracting from the first stimulus. And summation results in greater contraction of the motor unit. So we can see that here is we have our twitch, our initial contraction, and it starts to relax, but before it gets back down to threshold, another contraction occurs. And then the same thing, it starts to relax, and then another contraction occurs. So these are graded responses, a graded summation. And so you can see here, each trough is another stimulus, another action potential being elicited on the motor unit, such that a contraction can occur. And so if the frequency of motor neuron signaling increases, summation and subsequent muscle tension in the motor unit continues to rise until it reaches a peak point. The tension at this point is about 3 to 4 times greater than the tension of a single twitch, so it's about 3 to 4 times greater, and a state referred to as incomplete tetanus. During this state of incomplete tetanus, the muscle goes through quick cycles of contraction with a short relaxation phase for each. So that's exactly what we're seeing here. Short relaxation and then another contraction. Short relaxation, another contraction. But if the stimulus frequency is so high that the relaxation phase completely disappears, the contractions become continuous in a process called tetanus. So there's no relaxation here. This is an incredibly strong contraction or tension. And so that's what we're seeing when we're talking about complete tetanus and incomplete tetanus when we see the wave summation. So this is happening here, but it's so strong that there's just no relaxation. So now we can talk about muscle contraction differences and muscle fibers. And so when we're talking about the two different types of muscle contractions, we have one that relates to tension and one that relates to length. So isotonic is when the length of the muscle changes, but the tension remains constant during that contraction. Isometric is the length of the muscle not changing, but the tension increases during muscle contraction. So think of this as when you're doing a bicep curl, when you have it down by your waist and you start to pull that weight up, the length of the muscle is changing, but the tension is remaining constant. And then when you go down, it's the same thing. But say before you go all the way down, you stop halfway, the length of the muscle isn't changing anymore, but that tension is increasing because it's getting harder to hold that weight. So that's isometric. The isotonic is the actual movement, the changing of the angle of the elbow. So when we're talking about muscle movement, we have an insertion and an origin when we're talking about muscle insertion or muscle placement. So insertion is when the muscle is attached to the movable bone. And so that would be the insertion of the brachioradialis muscle into the bone over here. And then the origin of that brachioradialis muscle would be attached to the immovable bone, so the humerus here. And so this bone is not moving, whereas this bone is the one that is actually moving up and down. The agonist is talking about muscles, and the agonist mover is, when we're doing a bicep curl, the biceps brachii. So it's the prime mover of pulling that. The synergist is helping with holding that weight and starting the contraction of moving it, but the biceps brachii is the agonist, the main mover. And the antagonist is the muscle that is not working as hard during the actual movement of the weight or whatever this muscle is doing. Rather, it is the stabilizing force on the backside, or it's so that you think of it as the antagonist muscle group working when the muscle is coming down. So when the biceps is coming back down, your antagonist muscle might be helping a little bit on its way down. Same thing goes for when you're doing a triceps like press or something focusing on the triceps. The triceps would be the agonist and the biceps would be the antagonist. And then when we're talking about muscle fibers, we have 3 different types, and all skeletal muscles are going to contain the different types of muscles. They just vary in proportions based on the primary function of the muscle. So on this slide I have slow oxidative and fast oxidative because they compare relatively similar to each other. Slow oxidative have a very slow contraction, whereas fast oxidative have a very quick contraction where the cross bridges are releasing and reform quickly. Slow oxidative is fatigue resistant and has more blood supply, and this is because it's aerobic respiration with high oxidation. So it's basically a little bit more reliant on, actually very much so more reliant on oxygen. And it has more mitochondria for that because at the end of the mitochondrial transport chain, the electron transport chain, they have that oxygen receptor, or terminal oxygen acceptor. And so that's so that we can have aerobic respiration in these muscle fibers. And so we also need myoglobin in there, which is an oxygen carrying molecule similar to hemoglobin, helps enhance the capacity for aerobic respiration. And we'll see these types of fibers in our postural muscles and lower limbs. We'll see them when we need to do something for a long extended period of time, such as sitting upright and holding a strong posture or keeping your shoulders back. If you're running a really long time, swimming, biking, these are muscle fibers that need to be able to carry out extended activity for a long period of time. Whereas fast oxidative are going to fatigue significantly more quickly than slow oxidative fibers. There'll be less blood supply to them, and so they won't have nearly as much myoglobin. The aerobic and anaerobic respiration occurs in fast oxidative. It's mostly aerobic, but there is a significant chunk of anaerobic in there as well. And so there's less myoglobin, and intermediate movements such as walking or standing up occur with fast oxidative muscle fibers. So think of fast oxidative as intermediate fibers between slow oxidative and fast glycolytic fibers. Fast glycolytic fibers are going to have the fastest contractions of the three. This relies solely on anaerobic glycolysis, utilizing less ATP per cycle and fatiguing the quickest. These produce rapid and forceful contractions for quick and powerful movements, such as when we're weightlifting, powerlifting, or bodybuilding. So when we have really short, quick bursts and use that anaerobic glycolysis pathway, and obviously the creatine phosphate pathway too.